Good morning, everyone. We're going to begin because our streamers are with us already, so we want to go ahead and welcome them. Thank you very much for joining us. We now have an average about 250 discrete streamers from all over the world, 22 states and the rest from the other nations of the world, and we're thrilled you're with us. If you would like, if you're visiting here in this room or on the internet, and would like an email blast from me every Thursday telling you what's coming up into this room, if you're here in this room, please sign the clipboards that we have over here. They're green sheets of paper. Give us your name and contact information. We'll tell you what's coming up on a Thursday morning about the following Sunday. If you are streaming with us, you can simply go to the appropriate place there online and give us your name for the mailing list. Also, we love to ask everyone to make sure they're contributing or pledging, so you can go to the donate button and click right there if you're online with us, and if you have yet to pledge, please see the people over here at this table, and we will fix you up. We have red welcome bags around for those of you who are visiting with us. They contain brochures describing all the different ministries of All Saints Church. We'd love for you to pick one of those up today as well. All Saints is a church that feels that faith needs action. So we kind of think about our worship being completed once we take action every week. Today's focus at the action table is the environment. There are places in Colorado which are threatened with degradation, and we hope that you will go and get informed about this particular place and sign a letter to our congresspeople to take action. I want to make sure that you all know what's available for your Christmas purchases today at the bookstore. I am thrilled to have our speaker here, in part because he's just a great human being, a great, exciting scholar, Franciscan monk, and also because he is the neatest thing since sliced bread about the academic life and telling us about Thomas Merton, who many of you know was my North Star and helped me leave law school and find my way into the priesthood. And so he has written a book called The Franciscan Heart of Thomas Merton, which I so heartily recommend. I'm on my third read of this and have been preaching from it. And you can get it over here, along with other titles of his, Dating God, and also The Last Words of Jesus. Dating God is his explication of the heart and life and love, live and love in the way of St. Francis. Also, we have Thomas Merton volumes for you. Many people ask me, where do I start with Thomas Merton? And I frequently suggest that they start with this volume called Essential Writings, which are just the best of Thomas Merton put into one anthology with proper annotations so that you can go to the original text from which these are excerpted. And also his book, Conjectures of a Guilty Bystander, which involves a lot of his journal writings, including that wonderful epiphany we talk about here that he had on the corner of 4th and Walnut in Louisville. So a word about our speaker today. And he's going to get at, he saved the best to last. Talk about the essential, I think, one of the essential teachings of Merton, which is so transformative. Our speaker was born in Pensacola, Florida, raised in Utica, studied theology and journalism at St. Bonaventure University, where Thomas Merton taught, before entering the Order of Friars Minor, becoming a Franciscan. In addition to full-time undergraduate studies, he worked as a professional photographer. For a time, owned a freelance photography company and specializing in sports and editorial work. He has ministered throughout the country. He continues to write in magnificent ways, has a weekly sermon that he puts online, has a fantastic website. I recommend you all Google Dan Horan and go there. Without further introduction, I want to get at it. So, will you please join me in warmly welcoming Father Dan Horan?
Thank you very much, Ed. And we just seem to have some technical difficulties, which is fitting, given that Thomas Merton, as some of us reflected together yesterday during our Advent Quiet Day, was very skeptical of the technological advantages and solutions that technology poses to us. But I can get started and say a little bit about what I'd hope to share with you as we get back into the 21st century. First, I should say, I'd be remiss if I didn't thank you again, both for the invitation, and Ed especially, for the invitation and the hospitality that's been shown to me here at All Saints. It's been a tremendous, 48 hours. There's been a lot in just a short period of time, so it seems like longer, and I look forward, hopefully, for another opportunity to be back with you. The energy and spirit here is tremendous. As Ed has said, and as I'm sure he has relayed to you in sermons and other talks and private conversations, the true self was very essential to his own vocational journey and has been, I think, for a lot of us. Some of us may not have been as familiar with the writings or the thought of and teachings of Thomas Merton, but may have had glimpses of this notion of the true self through other authors, other friends of All Saints like Father Richard Rohr, a fellow Franciscan of mine, who was also very influenced and continues to be deeply inspired by Thomas Merton and his understanding of the true self. So Ed had asked me to spend this time with you this morning during the Rector's Forum, talking a little bit more about the true self, and talking a little bit about where it comes from. In other words, the foundations or background for Merton's understanding. So I have to forewarn you. I mentioned in my sermon this morning, and this is a spoiler alert for those who came and are going to the 11:15, that at one point I risked sounding a little too technical or a little boring. Well, I always risk sounding a little boring, but we're going to get a little technical for a little bit, but then go right into Thomas Merton's discussion and teaching on the true self. But this, I hope, will give us some grounding for what I believe is, in fact, the Franciscan heart that Thomas Merton had. He was, through and through, a Trappist monk. But he was somebody deeply informed and inspired by the way and life of Francis of Assisi and many Franciscan theologians and spiritual writers over the centuries, much more than I think a lot of people have considered previously. But I'd like to begin with an observation by another friend of All Saints. This is sort of like the best of. We got Richard Rohr, here's Jim Finley, who says that Merton's whole spirituality, now he was a novice of Merton's, Merton was his spiritual director. He is a tremendous spiritual guide in our own time, retreat leader. He writes that Merton's whole spirituality, he believes, in one way or another, pivots on this question of ultimate human identity. Who are we? The life of faith, then, and the journey of the Spirit is motivated by and directed toward answering two questions for Thomas Merton. This idea of ultimate human identity is really talking about a coin that has two sides, a coin that cannot be split or separated, a coin that reflects both who am I in terms of an ultimate question and who is God. And these are not and never can be separable searches. When we think that they are, well, then we get led astray, Merton would suggest. Thomas Merton also believes that deeply situated within each of us, all of us, we have this intrinsic, this sort of building block, this kind of piece of our spiritual DNA that calls us toward newness, toward growth, toward renewal, or as he puts it, a drive, an instinct for a liberation of creative power. We seek to awaken in ourselves a force which really changes our lives from within. And yet, this same instinct tells us that this change is a recovery of that which is deepest, most original, most personal in ourselves. To be born again, to seek this renewal, to discover our true selves, and to discover God, is not to become something or somebody else. That's what the world tells us. More on that in a moment. Instead, it means to become ourselves. Before we get into that, a little segue or a little tangent, not really tangential, a little foundational reflection on the guy who made my outfit very popular 800 years ago. Yes, now that I'm in Pasadena, I have to be ready for the red carpet, so I've been practicing. So when I walked from about 5 blocks away up for the 9 o'clock liturgy this morning, and as I was walking up Los Robles, I thought, oh man, somebody's going to stop and ask me, what are you wearing? And there are two ideas. One is, oh, this guy's on his way back to the Arclight, doubling down for his Star Wars. Which would have been the easy way out, or I could have done what I would have to say to E! Entertainment on the red carpet when they ask, which is, well, I'm wearing Francis of Assisi. And so, in addition to being a stylish fashion designer, he was also something of a great spiritual leader for all Christians, for non-Christians, for even people of goodwill who espouse no faith whatsoever. He remains one of the most fascinating figures in all of, I would say, history, at least for the last 2,000 years. And he wrote Thomas Merton wrote, in 1941 in one of his journals. He wrote an excerpt in the original Latin of something that Francis of Assisi preached to his brother friars, not in a liturgical sermon, but in a little, what we called the collected admonitions. Basically what happened is that even in Francis's own time, the order, the community of people following him grew, and he would go around from community to community and sort of admonish them, hence the name admonition, or exhort them to live better Christian lives, to remember their roots, to remember who it is that they are, because sadly, people started liking the friars a lot. And what happens when that happens, it doesn't, I'm sure this isn't the case with Ed, since he's not here at the moment, so I won't say this about the rector, but, if you get told you're really, really good, your sermons are good, everybody loves you, sometimes, not Ed though, but friars, Franciscans, might get a little bit of a big head. You might start thinking, you know what, that is right. We are pretty good. And Francis saw this, was concerned about it, said humility is essential. You can't lose sight of that. Goes around and he tells his brothers not to forget the fact that, and here's the quote, what a person is before God, that he or she is and nothing more. The converse is also true, by the way. He was talking to a bunch of arrogant Franciscans. But for those who, like we hear in Mary's Magnificat in our lessons in the liturgy today, are the lowly of the world, the downcast and the downtrodden, the converse is true, that what you are before God, that you are in nothing less. This is getting at the true self, who we are before God. The reason I point out this quote is that in 1941, decades before Merton will actually develop this in a more explicit way, he talks about the true self through the images and draws on the inspiration of Francis of Assisi. He points out, and this is probably the earliest iteration of his own reflection on what will be developed into this great teaching, he says, what we are, that is our identity, is only truly known to God, not ourselves, not to other men and women. The greatest terror of the particular judgment, in other words, what we're afraid of isn't death as such. We should be afraid of the fact that perhaps the moment after our death, we appear before the face of God and we finally learn our identity, the true identity. We finally see ourselves as we really are, the measure of our identity, of our being, and the two are the same, and this is the amount of our love for God. And he says it's terrifying because we might spend our whole lives trying to be something else. And we may not even recognize ourselves. In a 1946 letter, now this is 2 years before the Seven-Story Mountain is published, before Thomas Merton is Thomas Merton. He's not known now at this point. He's just a monk like others in training to be ordained a priest and the like. And he writes to one of his college professors from Columbia University, and he says that Duns Scotus and St. Bonaventure are tremendous. Now, these are two medieval Franciscan philosophers and theologians. Everybody's a big fan of Duns Scotus, right? Yeah, okay. One is, thank you, Christopher. The rest of you will be after this. I pulled this yesterday, too. Some of you recall. Rupert of Deutz, remember? I hope everybody Googled him later. Okay. For those streaming, I'm sorry to leave you out. Google Rupert of Deutz. He says that a book on this Scotus is brewing. I can see that. He admits it will take time, though, and God will have to give me a lot of special graces if I'm going to do it well, because Scotus is something big. Also, he is one of the ones who most glorifies Christ, that is, gives the incarnate word, that is, the man God, the full limit of everything that can be given him. Scotus is the one whose philosophical arguments have been dubbed, lead him to being called the subtle doctor. Even in his own lifetime, his students referred to this because his thought, his philosophy was so dense, so subtle, so nuanced, that it was actually very difficult for people to wrap their heads around. And here, this is something that Merton recognizes. He says, I need these special graces because Scotus is one tough cookie. In truth, that Scotus book was never written. Aw, it would have been nice. But maybe it actually was. Not as a Scotus book per se, but as what would become New Seeds of Contemplation, the book that Ed talked about as being so transformative for him. It has been for me as well. In addition to the theological and philosophical insight acquired from Scotus's work, Thomas Merton also was fascinated by the Jesuit poet Gerard Manley Hopkins. Now, that's a much more familiar name, right? Yeah, I see some hands going up already. The grandeur of God, right? Hopkins himself was deeply influenced by this medieval British Franciscan John Duns Scotus. In his journals and his letters, he writes about reading Scotus when he was in Oxford himself. And this idea of inscape, which pervades Hopkins's poetry, is really very closely associated to Thomas Merton's true self, and both of which come from an insight from Scotus. So since I know most of you already know everything about Scotus, for those who don't, I'll just say a few things. He was born about 1265, around 66. Records weren't very good at that time. He entered the friars in 1279 and was ordained a priest on March 17, 1291. That's the only secure date we have other than his death. Everything else is kind of based around that. He studied both at the universities of Oxford and Paris, and then he dies on November 8th in 1308. He was only in his early 40s, which always is intimidating because he did such wonderful things. My time is ticking, I feel. He came up with this and was concerned about, and this is one of the insights among many that we could look at, but it's most closely tied to Merton's teaching on the true self, is what is referred to in medieval philosophy as the principle of individuation. Scotus believed that what made something an individual or particular thing, you, or this chair, and the like, was intrinsic or coextensive with the very being of that particular thing. I told you this was going to get boring, but hang on. We'll get to the exciting part. This notion, this idea, was eventually called hakeitas in Latin. It's a great water cooler phrase for Monday. What did you do this weekend? Oh, I learned a little bit about hakeitas. How about you? I watched the football game. It means thisness in Latin. So here's what we can break down, and this is overly simplistic for the philosophers out there. I apologize. I'm not doing Scotus justice, but maybe this will help us to get an understanding, a little taste of what's so radical about what Scotus proposes. He says that what makes this thing not that thing, that's the question of individuation. He says what makes that is something that's identical with the thing's very being. It's coextensive. It exists in the same reality. It's not separable. It's not distinguishable except in a kind of conceptual way. To put it in a kind of a comparative sense, we can look at a somewhat contemporary of his. He dies, Thomas Aquinas dies in 1274, so around the same time. And Thomas, of course, becomes very influential in Christian philosophy and theology for centuries. Thomas holds a position on what makes something something, this something, and not another something, very similar to a lot of other theologians and philosophers of the time. It's what I like to call the Play-Doh theory. Not Plato like the ancient Greek philosopher. Play-Doh, the non-toxic clay that children love to eat and make pies out of. And you'll probably play with at Christmas with your nieces and nephews and children and grandchildren. You'll be like, oh yeah, I would love one of these pizzas you made that's pink and green. Yeah. The Play-Doh idea is this. Aquinas and others held that what makes something a particular thing are its accidental attributes. That first and foremost, a thing shares its essence or nature in a universal sense. So to put it kind of simply, we, all of us in this room that are human beings, share our humanity. That comes first. And what distinguishes us are it's kind of a list of things Aristotle came up with. Accidental attributes like height, weight, age, shape, size, number, these kinds of things. And so that because I'm this tall and I weigh this much and I'm this bald and I'm this old, that makes me me and not Frank. He has all these other things and you have all these other things and the person next to you and the like. That's what makes us different. But first and foremost, we share our humanity. Scotus says it's kind of the reverse. That actually what makes us a particular thing isn't a secondary dimension or accidental quality, to use Aristotle's language, but rather something that's deeply intrinsic. It's like the fact that we exist. It's so primordial, it's so present, that it's there from the very beginning. That we exist is reflective of this. It's so wrapped up in human dignity, and it's not just about humanity, but all of creation. The Latin here is the quidditas, in other words, for Aquinas and most of the other thinkers of this time. That is, the whatness of something was primarily important. Scotus says, no, the particularity, the thisness, the hakcheitas is what's most important. Stay with me. We're going to make it through. Scotus felt that this emphasis on the whatness, the chairness of something, the humanness of something, the horseness of something, the Trumpness of something. The humanness of something. Now, what makes something, the emphasis on the what of something is beneath the dignity of an all-loving and creative God. God would never have made a joke like that. Hakcheitas accounts for both the absolute uniqueness, the this of something, and the inherent dignity and value of all creation. Because it's not something that's added onto the Play-Doh. This is where that enters the picture for Thomas Aquinas and others. It's like God takes humanness, a big tub of humanness, and grabs a glob and says, I'm going to make a Dan Horan, and makes the shapes and this stuff, and boom, into history I go. Scotus says that's BS. If we believe in a God who's all-loving, all-merciful, if we believe in the absolute intrinsic dignity of all human beings, and he starts with humanity, but it influences everything. He says, then God must, from all eternity, imagine me in my particularity into existence. And yes, we share a common humanity. We share a something with others. But that's not what comes first for God. This has radical pastoral and personal implications. Human dignity means that it's inalienable. We talk in our world today like you can do something or think a certain way or say a certain something, as terrible as it is, whatever horrible, terrific actions people do, and we can say, well, they've lost their right, they're no longer human, etc. And even if we're not so explicit, we treat people this way. And this understanding, if you talk about accidental attributes and a humanness that's collective, and that's what's important, then you can say, well, yeah, you're no longer fitting my mold, my idea. You no longer resemble that tub of Play-Doh. And so you're out and I can treat you differently. For Scotus, that dignity and human value can never be separated from God's creatures. The other thing is that it's not just human beings that God creates with hakcheitas in this way, but rather God sees all of creation in the eternal plan of God, and as God creates everything, every blade of grass, every grain of sand, every bit of stardust out in the cosmos and the galaxies, everything. You know the expression, it's not very familiar here in Pasadena, but where I'm from, where I live in Boston now, this is true, right? Like every snowflake is different, every snowflake's unique, and we go, aw, and then we have a winter like last February, where every one of those unique snowflakes stuck around for about 6 months longer than winter. It was terrible. But this is reflective of that kind of anecdote, that sort of adage. Scotus says, yes, God loves every blade of grass into existence, and no blade of grass will ever be replicated, ever be repeated. No human being either. Everything that exists bears a certain intrinsic dignity. And we share a kinship then with the whole community of creation because God has lovingly brought all of the cosmos into existence. We are part of something greater than ourselves. It gives us something to think about. Just to quote him a little bit, God didn't delight, well, to paraphrase, I should say, God didn't delight simply in the essence of a thing. God doesn't just love horseness and humanness and grassness, but rather God individually loved and willed each aspect of creation into existence. God cannot limit the reading then, or we, cannot limit the reading of Genesis 1:31 to suggest that humanity in general was created very good, but to recall that each and every person and all of creation, it's only at the end, as Genesis 1 suggests to us, that we come to see that God recognizes all of creation as very good. Hakcheitas, then, considered in the human person, in you and in me, seems to invest each with a unique value as one singularly wanted and loved by God, quite apart from any trait that person shares with others or any contribution he or she will make to society. It is not what we do. It's not what we have. It's not how we act that makes us loved by God and worthy of love from others. That's a tough pill to swallow when how we act sometimes is very against what God wishes for us. Rather, it is who we are, who we really are, who we are before God as individually created, willed, and loved into being by God. That is the source of our dignity and value. Are you with me? All right. So Thomas Merton. He loves this. He gets it. In chapter 5 of that book, New Seeds of Contemplation, which is titled Things in Their Identity, not surprisingly, this is the chapter in which we see both the most kind of immediate influence of Hakcheitas, and it's also the chapter in which Thomas Merton first introduces this idea of the true self. It begins, somewhat oddly maybe to readers, with like a hymnic reflection. It's really poetic on the nature of a tree's relationship to the Creator in and through its simple existence as a particular tree, being itself and striving after nothing else. This echoes both Scotus, but also, again, the designer of my outfit, Francis of Assisi. Now, we all know the great Franciscan Canticle of the Sun, Canticle of the Creatures, that great poem of Francis of Assisi's that we usually sing, right, in worship, you know. There's the Lutheran anthem version. There's the all creatures of our God and King. Does that sound familiar? You open all the stops on the organ, the whole church is shaking. Yeah. And then there's the other one, right? There's the more contemporary Marty Haugen edition. I don't know if you've sung that one here too. The heavens are telling the glory of God. Another beautiful one. They're both great. But the problem with them is the same problem we have with the, what I might call the Francis Statue Industrial Complex. Also known as the bird bath industry. Yeah. It's adorable and it's cute, and there's truth in it. Yes, Francis loved deer. Yes, Francis loved birds and preached them. Yes, I suppose Francis loves to stand for decades in your garden holding a bowl of water. And yes, there's poetry and music wrapped up in the Canticle of the Creatures. Praised be you, my Lord, through Sir Brother Sun. Praised be you, my Lord, through Sister Water and Mother Earth and Sister Bodily Death, from whom no one can escape. But when we just sing it without thinking about what we're singing, when we just go, "Aw, Francis in the garden," without thinking about why he's in the garden, we miss the deep theological truth that's conveyed here and that Merton picks up on with this business about trees. Because Francis of Assisi's prayer, the Canticle of the Creatures, is really a reflection on creation and a reflection on humanity that says something about who we are and how God sees all of creation. We're actually not just romantically and naively connected to the rest of creation. Brother Sun and Sister Moon sounds adorable, but it's true. The nitrogen and the oxygen and the carbon and all the other elements that make up our very corporal material reality are the same elements that make up everything else in this universe, all the way down to little things that only Brian Greene knows about that I don't know anything about. This reality is reflected in what Merton for sure, but also Francis of Assisi celebrates. He also believes that all of creation has an inherent relationship to its creator, that God loves creation into existence, and that each aspect of creation, the world around us, praises God in a chorus of praise like we see in the Psalms, like we see in the book of Job and elsewhere. But it's we human beings with our gift of free will where we get to decide to be our true selves or something else. The sun gives praise to God, Francis of Assisi says, by shining and providing warmth and light. And water gives praise to God by refreshing us. And Mother Earth gives praise to God by providing all sorts of green things and nourishment and the rest. And he says in the Canticle of the Creatures that human beings give praise to God when we forgive, when we reconcile, when we love one another. Merton goes on and he says that no two beings are exactly alike. None, ever. And their individuality is no imperfection. On the contrary, the perfection of each created thing is not merely in its conformity to an abstract type, which is the other Plato, if you might remember from your philosophy classes, right? Plato, the Greek philosopher, said that there are these ideal types, right? These perfect images, and that we participate in that in an imperfect way in this material world. But rather, he says, this particular tree will give glory to God by spreading its roots in the earth and raising its branches into the air and the light in a way that no other tree before or after it ever did or ever will do. Do we ever stop to think about that? That every blade of grass we step on, every tree that we look at, every other animal on this planet, every other human being is so unique that they'll never be replicated. He doesn't just, that is, Merton adopts Scotus's hakcheitas, but instead he uses it to talk about humanity, to talk about our vocation, to talk about us discovering our true selves, our ultimate identity, as Jim Finley put it. Unlike trees or mountains or blades of grass or other animals, human beings are not simply left to be individuals in a passive sense. He says, in fact, that human beings, for us, our holiness is more than just our humanity. Which for a lot of people is enough, right? For all those who are interested in mountaintop removal. No, my humanity is what makes me holy, and this tree and this iron ore and these mountains, they're just for our use. You can use all sorts of other terrible examples of how we treat other aspects of creation to fill in the blank. Merton explains again that this principle of individuation, this hakcheitas, is what is the source of who we really are. But that most often, you and me, men and women, we don't realize this. And he says that God leaves us, you and me, free to be whatever we like. On the one hand, we're like, woohoo, party time. When the God's away, the humans will play. But the choice is ours. The playing isn't so fun. We can be ourselves or not, he goes on to say. We can do as we please. We are actually at liberty to be real or to be unreal. We can be true or we can be false. The choice is ours. Human beings, you and I, we have the challenge of being co-creators with God and ultimately discovering the meaning of our existence and our true identity in God alone. I'm talking about the false self. Merton writes in the spirit of sin, and he's really talking about original sin, or as we discussed yesterday, original forgetfulness, is maybe more apt. He says, to say that I was born in sin is to say I came into the world with a false self. I was born in a mask. I came into existence under a sign of contradiction, being someone that I was never intended to be, and therefore a denial of what I am supposed to be. The reason he ties this to original sin, this idea of the false self, us not being who it is God has created us to be, or as St. Francis says, who we are before God, he ties this to what we might call the Adam myth, or the Adam and Eve myth, or the snakes and apples and fig leaves and garden business that Christians have been so focused on for so long. Merton looks at this and he says that what's really going on in Genesis 3 is a refusal to accept who it is that we are really created to be as human beings. In the meantime, we're seeking to be something else. The so-called original sin, right, that gets projected into Genesis 3 is a forgetting or a denying or a refusing to be what God has created us to be. That's the temptation. The snake says what? You don't have to be just human. You don't have to be like this. You can be like what? Like God. The temptation is to be, from the beginning, something other than what we're created to be, which is why I said, the serpent's probably like a character from Mad Men, the first advertising agent. Sorry to the advertisers out there, but here we go. We can think of the many ways in which we, like the serpent, or like Adam and Eve facing the serpent, are faced with serpents in our own time. We are we're faced with, confronted with, is the word I was looking for, all sorts of messages that we are not good enough as we are, as who we are. We need to be somebody else. And then the world, this market, is filled with messages like, if only I were what? Better looking, younger, older, thinner, taller, smarter, more respected, well-known, better liked in another relationship, more disciplined, more focused in prayer, in charge, more confident, etc., etc., etc. Our malls and our internet browsers are full of products, services, and methods, all aimed at conjuring precisely this response. But with each, we discover that we're being set up again and that betrayal is inevitable. When Merton talks about the false self, it's that insecurity to look at ourselves and one another with the eyes of God. And instead to believe this myth, this ruse that we're not okay, that we're not lovable. Merton says that the false self is false insofar as it's anything apart from that identity. Remember Hopkins? That inscape that God created or intended from all of creation. Variously, Merton says that the false self is a ruse. It's an illusory self. It's unreality. It's not true. That's why it's false. And that we only find our true selves, who we really are, by finding the one who really knows us, the one who loved us into existence as such, who from all eternity knew you and loved you into existence as much as God has loved everything else in creation. And Merton says then that the secret of my identity is hidden in the love and mercy of God. He believes that we can only discover then our true selves in our discovery of God, the one who is always already reaching out to us in relationship. The means of moving toward that true self. And I'm not convinced, and I don't think Merton was either, that we ever truly get there. Not fully. But we strive to, in a spirit of ongoing conversion. And we do it through contemplation, through prayer, not through buying more things or spending more time on Facebook or any other way that we might be tempted to construct ourselves. He says that prayer is not only the lifting up of the mind and heart to God, but it is also the response to God within us. The discovery of God within us. It leads ultimately to the discovery and fulfillment of our own true being in God. He also says that our discovery of God is, in a way, God's discovery of us. We cannot go to heaven to find God because we have no way of knowing where heaven is or what it is. And boy, do we spend a lot of time wasted trying to figure that out. That's beyond the point. God comes down from heaven, whatever that means. And if God finds us, that's what we're getting ready to celebrate on Friday, that this has happened. God looks at us from the depths of God's own infinite actuality, which is everywhere, and seeing us gives us a new being and a new mind in which we can also discover God. But again, the choice is ours. We only know God insofar as we are known by God. And our contemplation of God is a participation in God's contemplation of God's self. In order to know and love God as God is, Merton says, we must have God dwelling in us in a new way. And this, I think, ties back to our lessons from Scripture this Sunday and prepares us for what we're about to celebrate. Not only must God be in us, must we seek and see the God who St. Augustine says is closer to us than we are to ourselves. Not only should we find God in God's creative power, but we find God in God's mercy. Not only in God's greatness, but in God's littleness, in the lowliness, in the vulnerability of a child, by which God empties God's self and comes down to us to be empty in our emptiness, and so fill us with God's fullness. Given that we have very limited time and I have to go upstairs to preach at the next liturgy, we have to really wrap up there. But my hope is that this is just a little bit of a taste. I think this was Ed's wish to help us to think together in new ways about who we are and how we find ourselves and how we can think about one another. And I encourage you to look into this a little bit further. That New Seeds of Contemplation, that book of Mertens, gives us so much more insight into this discovery, much more than I could have given you in 25 minutes. But I thank you for your attention, for this real kind of fast-paced look. And I wish you all a very blessed remainder of Advent and the Christmas season to come. God bless you.